mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Xtrem Mysteries.
According to the book itself, the 66 books of the Bible were written by 40 different authors over a period of roughly 1,600 years. Many of the books have a name attached that many take to be the author of that particular book. But does anyone really know who wrote it?
Under examination, the Bible shows itself to be the work of a group of unknown and imaginative clerics, and that it was recompiled in later centuries in such a way as to strengthen Christianity's grip on its followers.
Critics have been crying fraud ever since Moses came down from the mountain. But for thousands of years, the Bible has been considered holy by people all over the world. Who's right? Judaism believes the entire Old Testament to be sacred scripture, but gives special reverence to the first 5 books of the Bible known as the Torah. The Christian faith regards the entire Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament as well, as being divinely inspired. But do we know who actually wrote the most universal and most revered pages in the history of the world? Could it be, as most Christians believe, that God is the ultimate author of the Bible? Or is it possible that the human authors were simply scribes? For that matter, do we actually know the true identity of the individual authors of each of the books found in the Bible? Does the fact that someone's name appears as the title of the book necessarily mean that person wrote it? For generations, skeptics have insisted the Bible is nothing more than the work of clever men. Could it be that modern technology can finally put that notion to the test? In a moment, we'll try and determine if a better understanding of who actually wrote the words so many millions hold in trust and reverence can change the way we live. The term Bible refers to a collection of writings, individually called books, that are regarded as holy by millions of people the world over. These books are invested with great authority by those who follow their precepts, but that authority and the true identity of the individual authors has been questioned by scholars and skeptics for hundreds of years, beginning with the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. Although many scholars disagree, it is generally accepted by Jews and Christians that Moses had something to do with the writing of the Torah. But what exactly was his role?
Many Christians and Jews believe the Bible was authored by God. He simply used people to do the actual writing. Oral tradition passed on by the Jewish people for thousands of years affirms that Moses was the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But some modern scholars claim the Torah was composed from 4 distinct works, written or at least edited at 4 different times in history by 4 different people, and then compiled into the 5 books of the Torah. According to this theory, first proposed by German scholars, the oldest work comes from a source identified as J, sometime in the 9th or 10th century BC. This designation is used because the name this writer used for God was Yahweh, which in the German spelling begins with the letter J. The second work derives from the 8th century BC from a source referred to as E, and seems to focus most on religious and moral concerns. This designation was chosen because the word for God used by this writer was Elohim. The third document is dated to the 7th century BC and is ascribed to the D source, the Deuteronomist, because it contains the legal codes of Deuteronomy. The fourth and final document, referred to as P because of its emphasis on priestly matters, is dated between the 6th and 4th centuries BC. This part of the work appears to be more concerned with Israelite ritual and worship.
Proponents of this theory believe that J wrote his history of the Kingdom of Israel from the standpoint of a resident of Judah. Now E lived in the northern half of the divided kingdom, and he would have written his view of things from that perspective. When Assyria conquered the northern kingdom in 722 BC, many of the residents fled to the southern kingdom of Judah, and it's believed that they would have brought their sacred documents with them. Subsequently, J and E would have been combined into a single document. An unknown person, referred to as R, then combined all 4 documents into the first 4 books of the Hebrew Bible. Now to this, he added what we know as the book of Deuteronomy, thus completing the first 5 books of the Torah.
This, of course, is the scholarly argument. But is there any proof that this is what happened? Is it all simply speculation?
There is material in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, written long after the time of Moses. In Deuteronomy, the 5th book of Moses, we read about Moses' death. There are rabbis that claim that Moses wrote even the account of his death, because it was a prophecy. Jewish tradition holds that Moses was a prophet of the first order. Therefore, he could have foreseen and written about his death.
The Bible itself does not claim Mosaic authorship, so in that sense there isn't any reason to make it a matter of doctrine. But it is important to establish a distinction between authorship and source. Moses may or may not have been the author of the Torah, but there's reason to believe he is at least the source for much, if not most, of the information contained in the Torah. The question then becomes, what was his source?
According to a very old and respected Jewish tradition, Moses was merely the scribe. God gave him all the letters of the Torah arranged in a strict sequence without paragraphs, pages, or punctuation. According to this tradition, authorship of the Torah goes way beyond inspiration. This suggests that God himself wrote the Torah.
The Bible is packed with strange and unnatural tales, things that defy our personal experience and sense of logic. Even the staunchest Christian will admit that. If we were to read in a modern book about a man who could part the seas and walk on water or raise the dead, we would regard those claims extremely skeptically. Why should the Bible be exempt from such skepticism?
Obviously, the controversy over Bible authorship is not limited to the first 5 books of the Bible. Virtually all of the books have been questioned at one time or another by skeptics and scholars. But in recent years, modern science has been called upon with increasing frequency to support participants on both sides of the argument. Christians, by and large, accept the Bible and its various claims of authorship as a matter of faith. But occasionally, and with increasing frequency, secular discoveries tend to shore up that faith.
The book of Psalms is filled with beautiful poetry and passionate devotion to God. While it's been long acknowledged by conservative scholars that there may have been several authors of the various Psalms, most of them are attributed to King David. But other scholars have ridiculed this idea. There was no verification outside of the biblical accounts that David had ever existed. How could a man who never existed be responsible for writing the majority of the Psalms? Then, in 1993, archaeologists discovered a stone that was part of a shattered monument from the 9th century BC. The inscription on the stone commemorated a military victory by the king of Damascus over an ancient enemy, the House of David. This discovery was of stunning historical significance. Here was mention of King David, not only from a source outside of the Bible, but from an enemy of Israel. It essentially confirmed the existence of David, the great Israelite warrior king and psalm writer, as a real historical figure.
Archaeological discoveries are helping to establish some biblical authorship, but the controversy is not limited to books that have no author mentioned. Critics have attacked books whose author is not only named, but is actually writing in the first person.
It's clear that chapters 1 through 39 of the book of Isaiah were written by someone other than the rest of that book. These chapters are terse and compact, fitting the historical image of the prophet Isaiah, while the remainder shows a much more emotional and passionate prophet. It's unlikely that the same person wrote both.
In the final section, Isaiah mentions Cyrus by name, but Cyrus did not come on the scene for over 150 years. Could it be that Isaiah would have known in advance what the future would hold, even down to the name of the king?
Isaiah's identification of Cyrus indicates that there had to have been at least one other author, not writing about things that were going to happen, but things that had already happened, things written about in the past tense.
But once again, fate was about to upset the apple cart of scholarly consensus, and in a most unusual way. Could the book of Isaiah have been written hundreds of years after Isaiah died? Was the book of Daniel the product of Jewish clerics a mere 150 years before the birth of Christ? The issue was not resolved by impassioned debate in the high halls of academia, but by rock-throwing shepherds looking for lost sheep in the desert. The greatest archaeological discovery of the century, perhaps of all time, when we return. One of the truly unusual aspects of the Bible is that so much of it deals with prophecy, predictions of future events that have in fact actually happened. Critics use this fact to suggest that since no one can tell the future, the prophecies had to have been written after the fact, not before. But biblical history was written in 1947 when a Bedouin shepherd tending his flock near the cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea began throwing rocks into the many caves that might offer shade to a wandering lamb. Suddenly, he heard a tinkling sound like the sound of broken pottery. Envisioning some kind of buried treasure, he proceeded into the darkened recess of the cave, only to discover several large earthen jars. Most were empty, but one contained some kind of foul-smelling and decaying leather.
The discovery of ancient scrolls in caves above the Dead Sea set off an explosion of interest in biblical studies. What started out as a fairly modest discovery turned into an archaeological and biblical bonanza.
The scrolls contained copies of at least portions of every Old Testament book except Esther. Some of the findings were mere scraps, while one containing the entire book of Isaiah was 28 feet long. In very recent years, an extremely skeptical branch of Old Testament criticism has sometimes suggested that the books of the Old Testament were written as recently as 2 to 3 centuries before the time of Christ. The discovery of the Isaiah scroll at Qumran, dating to almost 200 BC, and other Old Testament books going back nearly as far, makes this criticism wholly unwarranted.
The book of Daniel is also a frequent subject of controversy. The accepted view for thousands of years was essentially that portrayed in the Bible. Daniel was an Israelite in captivity in the kingdom of Babylon around 605 BC, who wrote about his experiences there until about 540 BC. But critics have challenged that view on several points.
For a time, scholars pointed to inconsistencies in the book of Daniel as a sign that the author was not familiar with people or events of the 6th century. Daniel referred to Belshazzar as the last king of Babylon, while historical records seem to indicate that Nabonidus was the last king. If Daniel were the author of this book, he would have known who the king of Babylon was. Once again, archaeology helped untangle the riddle when tablets were found showing that Belshazzar was Nabonidus' son and functioned as co-regent over the kingdom when his father was away. Nabonidus was away when Daniel writes, and so Belshazzar was the governor, and Daniel once again is proved to be correct.
Daniel was undoubtedly written by an unknown author at a later date than is believed. Firstly, the book contains Greek or Aramaic words, yet the Greek occupation did not occur for another 200 years. Secondly, Daniel refers to the priestly class in Babylon as the Chaldeans, even though this term did not take on this meaning until much later.
But if that's true, how did the book of Daniel wind up as a canonical work among ancient scrolls that date back to at least 250 BC? Can the text of the book of Daniel be reconciled to a much earlier date?
Best answer is yes. As early as the 7th century BC, 100 years before Daniel, Aramaic was used as the official international language of Egypt, Syria, and Phoenicia. It's very possible that Daniel learned Aramaic in Jerusalem before he was taken to Babylon. Because of his position in government, this would have been a language with which he was familiar. As to the other criticism, the use of the word Chaldeans, we have only to look at history. Herodotus consistently spoke of the Chaldeans in ethnic terms. He acknowledged the fact that they were priests, and he accepted the fact that this condition went back at least to the time of Cyrus, or to the time of Daniel.
The criticisms of Daniel and Isaiah are the result of presuppositions on the part of many scholars that someone cannot predict the future, especially in the kind of detail that Daniel and Isaiah do. This presupposition then leads to the conclusions that these books could not have been written by the men to whom they are attributed in the time period during which they were supposed to have been written.
Could Daniel and Isaiah have been true prophets and written about events before they happened? And what about the books in the New Testament? Is there disagreement about who wrote those books as well? Apart from a natural curiosity, why does anyone care who the human authors really were? What impact will discovering the genuine authorship of the Bible have on our lives today? Given the supernatural character of much of the Bible, is there any way to know for certain? The New Testament, like the Old Testament, contains its share of books that have generated heated debate over the centuries. And once again, it is the first 4 books of the New Testament, or the Gospels, that have generated the greatest controversy. Oddly enough, these are books to which an author is assigned, but scholars continue to question whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were actually the authors of the books that bear their names.
One of the main sources of controversy concerning the Gospels is the historical content of their writings. Scholars are divided over whether or not these narratives record historical events or fiction, or perhaps a combination of both. And of course, each side approaches the question with a presupposition that these stories are either real or fictional events presented for some undefined purpose. The first 3 accounts of the life of Jesus, found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels. This is because these accounts are so similar in content. The Gospel of John, however, stands apart from these other 3 in both content and style. Bible critics scoff at the idea that these books were written by actual eyewitnesses to the events and try to assign a later date for the writings. If they're not eyewitness accounts, scholars reason, the stories must then be fiction. The story of the birth of Jesus is an excellent example.
In chapters 1 and 2, Luke wants to say that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of David. And to do so in a story form, he sends Jesus, in the womb of Mary, of course, back to be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. And the reason he says that happens is there was a census, for taxation purposes, of course, and Joseph has to go back to his ancestral home. The problem with that is there was no such census at the time Jesus was born, and the Romans would not have sent people back, in any case if there was a census, to their ancestral homes.
Scholars who take the position that Jesus' birth at Bethlehem is fiction reject the Gospels as historical sources. But Luke tells us plainly that not only is he writing the story, but that it is based on extensive investigation. Therefore, Luke should be given the same credibility as other historical documents from that time.
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed also good to me to write an orderly account for you.
And Peter appears to be speaking for all of those who were witnesses of Christ.
We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of His majesty.
No one can prove conclusively, of course, that Luke and Peter were telling the truth. On the other hand, there doesn't appear to be any evidence to support the notion that they are not. In fact, non-biblical sources seem to come down on the side of the apostles.
A man by the name of Papias, living at the end of the 1st century, knew the Apostle John and other people who had known other disciples of Jesus. He writes about the authorship of the Gospels, mentioning Matthew and Mark explicitly by name, at a date that is early enough to make it likely that he has preserved reliable information. Papias wrote that Mark acted as Peter's interpreter and recorded everything that Peter remembered. He also wrote that Mark did not write in exact chronological order, but instead worked hard not to omit anything that Peter had passed on to him. The historical mention of Matthew and Mark verifies that the authors of the Gospels were men living at the time of Jesus and not writing about him centuries later.
Many scholars claim there are contradictions between the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels, and they believe this means some other author must have been involved, probably at a much later date. But are these supposed contradictions really contradictions?
If we were to ask 4 separate people who were at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, what happened, their responses would all be different. The basic story would undoubtedly be the same, but the details would be based on each person's unique perspective. That does not mean that their stories are necessarily contradictory. Rather, each person's description would complement each of the others and actually provide a clearer view of the whole picture.
Apart from the four Gospels, it is generally accepted by scholars, both liberal and conservative, that the Apostle Paul wrote nearly half of the rest of the New Testament. In fact, the only New Testament book with no certain claim as to authorship in the early church is the letter to the Hebrews. We can speculate, debate, and theorize who wrote the letter to the Hebrews, but in the end, no one knows for certain. What the early church did agree on, however, is that if it was not from Paul, it was from one of his close followers, thus preserving the link with the apostle.
The Church, using the term to be more or less all-inclusive, teaches that the entire Bible is inspired by God, and in that sense, He is the true author. So why do we care whether or not there is a name attached to a particular book? Actually, there are several reasons. The identity of a book's author can give great insight into its meaning and intent. Also, the Bible is a profoundly influential book, and many people want to know about it even if they don't subscribe to either Jewish or Christian beliefs. But perhaps most importantly, knowing who the author is and something about his life lets us engage the text in a deeper, more meaningful way. Millions of people the world over are now engaged in trying to do just that with the great apocalyptic book of Revelation.
The last book of the Bible is a verbal picture of apocalyptic destruction, divine judgment, and the end of human history. These stark images have generated a great deal of debate over the years. Its style is so different from the rest of the Bible that questions naturally arise as to who actually wrote it. The book itself claims that it was written by John, but the question that has generated controversy for decades is, which John? Some conservative scholars believe the author to be John, the son of Zebedee, the same John who was a disciple of Jesus and who tradition says wrote the Gospel of John. Some other scholars take the position that the author of the book of Revelation is another person named John, whom they refer to as John the Revelator. They take the position that because of the differences in style and content between the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, it's too much of a stretch for both books to have been written by the same person. The Bible itself claims only that it was written by John, which John is not specified. But what the Bible does make clear is that this John is a man worthy of receiving some of the greatest revelations of all time.
Modern archaeological and scientific discoveries support the Bible as an accurate record of historical events. Ancient texts discovered in the last half-century demonstrate that it has remained largely unchanged through thousands of years and hundreds of translations. But is that enough to establish its authors as being divinely inspired?
One thing that sets the Bible apart from all other religious writings is the prophetic nature of the texts. And the proof of its prophetic value is demonstrated by the fact that the biblical prophecies do, in fact, come to pass.
If that's true, the authenticity of the written word could be of paramount importance to everyone in these troubled times, because in spite of the number of prophecies the experts tell us have been fulfilled, there are still a great many troubling predictions that are yet to be fulfilled. And if the men who wrote those prophecies are in fact who they claim to be, there is still much to be learned that could have a direct impact on our lives. It is probably not possible to prove in any scientific way that God was the inspiration that guided each of the 40 authors represented in the Bible. But we can look at the various questions raised and decide which answer has the highest degree of probability. After all, if the questions were easy, there wouldn't be any need of faith. Something to think about.